So proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the
Hi. Speaker today is Dr. Carugati. Kevin's a physician specializing in infectious diseases. He's an internist. He's trained at University of Pittsburgh, New York Medical College. Serves on many boards. He has won awards for writing on medical research topics. Kevin and I play a lot of golf together, although our approaches are totally different. Kevin likes to practice, I don't. Kevin likes to use a lot of different clubs. I'd prefer to use as few as possible. Kevin will analyze every hole and use the best club for each hole, doing a lot of thought. I don't think. I just pull out my driver and hit it. Kevin was on the golf team. I was not. In the end, though, we were about even. We both score in the low 70s. So Kevin can either give you a talk on medicine or a golf lesson. I'll leave it up to him.
All right, thank you. I got this. Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm Kevin Carugati, and I did 2 3-year residencies, actually, one in internal medicine, infectious disease, and one in laboratory research, administrative work, on a few boards, the American Respiratory Alliance in Pitt, and a community research board, also Quigley High School board for a while, and coached a basketball team when my daughters were young. And liked to speed read. Got my reading up to like about 1,800 words a minute, which is like reading a 300-page novel in about an hour, which makes reading kind of fun, you know. So my philosophy is community giving fulfills when you get older, and service lifts spirits, touches hearts, and gives the young a chance to realize their dreams. I mean, older people like us, we know a lot. We have to give it back to the young. So I had some slides, but it didn't work out, so I'll just talk, okay? So from time to time, we asked ourselves difficult questions like, why is the world filled with so much suffering, and what can we do about it? We could look at the numbers or statistics, like I could give you a lot of numbers, like how many people of infectious disease killed throughout history or wars. For instance, 300 million people were killed by smallpox just in the 20th century, but now we have vaccines against smallpox. But instead of doing it that way, let's analyze it in a more fun way. You know, are we having fun yet? You know, so let's look at science and how it analyzes in problems like, have infectious disease killed more people or wars killed more people? And let's look at infectious disease itself. and war and see what we can figure out using the scientific method. So science is mankind's greatest accomplishment. We live longer, we suffer less, we enjoy more pleasures and experiences. Fewer people are assaulted, oppressed, or exploited today by others because of science. Okay, you might not agree with that. Much suffering remains. We'll never have a perfect world, but there's no limit to what we can do if we apply science like we have done in the last 300 or 400 years. Let's talk for a minute about people dying in the 21st century. Cancer hits 1 out of every 2 Americans. Cardiovascular disease hits 1 out of every 2. So if you look around, one person will have a cardiovascular disease, another one a cancer. But people survive cancer. They survive it. The ratio is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In other words, the survivors out there, let's say there's 5 million survivors with skin cancer, 4 million survivors with breast cancer, 3 million survivors with prostate cancer, 2 million survivors with lung cancer, 1 million survivors with colon cancers. And so science is helping us survive these cancers. Cancer deaths are about 750,000 a year in the United States. Cardiac deaths about 1 million a year. And infectious disease deaths, which I work with or have worked with for the past 30 years, are about 1/3 of 1 million a year. But they're getting better with vaccines and antibiotics. So science has helped us over the last 300 or 400 years reduce suffering in infection, cancer, cardiovascular disease. What about war? Has science made war worse? Science has a lot of critics. There's a lot of people who say, if you believe in science, we're going to blow the world up in nuclear war. You're just Pollyanna. You have blind faith. You're just one of those people who's an optimist or a cheerleader. But there's a lot of scientific evidence out there that science has improved the world. The world is getting better. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. Not conjecture or people's opinions, but evidence. Evidence-based medicine, evidence-based science, evidence-based fact, analytical data, which you can't argue too much about, although I'm sure you will in your question and answer period, but it's been proven by many people. So many people ignore scientific evidence, okay? They generalize from anecdotes and stereotypes because TV news distorts reality with a lot of false facts, fake news. They're pessimistic. They do not believe in science progress that we've made. There's the old idea or joke about a pessimist is someone who's talking seriously to you. An optimist is someone who's trying to sell you something. So NBC, CNN, Fox News, they hold daily meetings about, they try to decide what their viewers should panic about today, pessimistically, how to outrage or frighten viewers. So you'll stay glued to their network. But science has measured our well-being in the last few years, and we have longer lives. We've gone from 40 years average lifespan to 80. We have more food all throughout the world, peace, safety. Democracies have increased from about 30 in the 1960s to 100, over 100, 103 today. We have more knowledge on the internet at our fingers, more leisure time. For instance, around 1910, before all the appliances were invented, people, well, mostly women, did housework for 45 to 50 hours a week. Now it's down to 10 or 12. In the old days, they had to spend an entire day washing and going, and washing clothes before washing machines. So anyway, we have vaccines, we have antibiotics, we have sanitation. Scientific method now has improved life, so this is the best time ever to be alive. As a matter of fact, the news should say that for the past 30 years, 100,000 people a day have been coming out of extreme poverty. That's a fact. But that's too optimistic. They'd rather give you pessimistic news. So anyway, some answers have been tried to get rid of infections and wars, like evil people cause suffering, let's defeat them and elect a strong leader. The ultimate good is to obey a certain tribe or nation or faith, and that will reduce suffering and wars and infectious disease. All these things have been tried, and they've all failed. For the last 350 years, science has been making the world a better place. From 1650 to 1750, we had the science revolution, Hume with the scientific method, we had Newton with physics, we had Galileo with astronomy, we had Harvey with medicine, we had Boyle with chemistry, Darby with the blast furnaces, and Pascal with mathematics and calculators. From 1750 to 1850, we had reason and logic with Voltaire with philosophy. We had Adam Smith in economics. We had Descartes and Kant giving us analytical reason. So science claims the world is getting better, and we have some facts about that, but the news will tell you that it's getting a lot worse. But we all want our children to have a better life. So STEM science, especially science, technology, engineering, math, is making the 21st century flourish. And that's what I teach: infectious disease, ethics, various things, and I try to pass that on to my students. Today is the best time to be alive. So we need some humor maybe when we're talking about serious science, but let's move ahead maybe we'll talk about House. He had an infectious disease show on TV. He had humor. He would say things cynically, pessimistically, like everybody lies. Normal is overrated. People never change. So maybe we'll call on House every now and then to keep me honest, because I'm sort of an optimist, as you may see. So what about war? War versus infectious disease. What has killed more? Well, wars throughout history, if you plot the curve, which they've done at Harvard, the number of wars in the world are coming down, 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 down all throughout history. And that's despite the fact that humans are defined by the scientists as a fascinating mammal with limited intelligence, because we have a tendency to kill each other in war. So there have been wars all throughout history, but we're seeing less and less wars as time goes on. What about infectious disease? Well, again, smallpox in the Middle Ages killed a third of Europe. Bubonic plague with blisters all over the body, also in the Middle Ages, killed another third of Europe. And cholera in cities with no sanitation kills people, but today we've improved sanitation with science. Today, though, there's 3 diseases in the world that kill 500 million people a year, or not a year, but infect 500 million people. There's 7 billion people on the planet Earth. 500 million people have hepatitis, especially overseas, so be careful when you travel, okay? 500 million people have tuberculosis, and they could infect you. Not so much in the United States, we've beat it. And 500 million people have malaria. Mosquitoes have been really bad throughout history. So we still have problems with infectious disease, but they're getting better, and war is also getting better. Okay, some of the statistics I can bore you with for a minute. The Black Death in 1350, the bubonic plague, killed third to half of Europe. Is it just happened in Europe? No. In India and China, we had pandemics throughout history that have killed them. The Roman Empire actually came down 542 in the Justinian era. A plague went through the Roman Empire, killed half of them, weakened them, and then the barbarians could come in and take them over. Same thing happened in ancient Greece. Same thing happened in ancient Babylon. Most civilizations all throughout history have been weakened by infectious disease by half and then taken over by some other country. That could happen to America someday, too. For instance, in the 16th century, the conquistadors came from Europe, settled America. They didn't have to kill the Indians that were here. They had smallpox and measles in Europe, and the Indians had never been exposed to smallpox and measles. So they just breathed on them, and 80% of them died. The Aztecs in Central America, the Incas in South America, and the American Indians too. So again, disease spreads. Now, let's talk a little bit about how we fight back. We fight back with antibiotics. We didn't have them until World War II, when the world got, they were using their energy to kill each other in World War I and World War II. And finally, they got their act together and said, let's settle back and do some science. So in the 1950s, penicillin was invented, and in the 1960s, we had amoxicillin and methicillin, and then in the 1970s, we were up to things like ticarcillin or timentin, and then in the 80s, we started with cephalosporins, which have the same kind of ring, benzene-type ring. But what happens with bacteria is that every 10 or 15 years, when you use these antibiotics, they mutate, they become resistant, and you have to invent some new antibiotics to kill the same germs. And so we have to stay ahead of the bacteria, not let them become pan-resistant. Like MRSA, maybe you've heard of that, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus skin infections, in which no antibiotic will cure you, and they cause death. So why will infectious disease get worse if we have antibiotics? Well, we have megacities coming up. We have many cities that have reached the size of 20 million and are going to go to 30 or 40 million in the next 20 or 30 years. And then things like SARS or Ebola or Legionnaires or various diseases might spread because of the crowding of people in these huge megacities. Also, it's hard to deal with viruses, not bacteria. Viruses are 100 times smaller than bacteria. Viruses cannot be seen by any laboratory microscope. The light microscope can only see down into microns, 10 to the minus 6. Those, I don't want to bore you with scientific mathematics, but you can't get down to nanometers, 10 to the minus 9, which viruses are tiny little things. We can't see them, we can't diagnose them, we can't treat them. So that makes it difficult in terms of dealing with them. What we usually do is measure the antibodies that your human body is making against the viruses. And then we assume that since your body is making antibodies against hepatitis or polio or something like that, you must have hepatitis or polio, because Mother Nature knows what they're doing, what she's doing. So what about how we fought back besides antibiotics with science? We have alcohols like ethanol will kill germs, but it evaporates quickly. We have aldehydes like formaldehyde that the pathologist uses with autopsies and things. We have halogens like chlorines. We have metals like sulfur that we put on burns. We have hydrogen peroxide. We have hexachlorophene. We have something called the quats, which are detergents that you use in your washing machine. Now, there's probably a lot of businessmen here. I am in Sewickley, right? This is Sewickley, so I'm sure there's a lot of businessmen here. So we have to fight back with using our wealth and our money to back science. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about GDP, the gross domestic product. The United States has the wealth. Our GDP, which is defined as the market value of our goods and services in a year, including what consumers buy, investments, government uses, and exports. GDP, yeah, I'm sure you all know what that is. We're up to $21 trillion a year in the United States. $21 trillion. Most of the world is around $3 trillion. Places like England, France, India, Italy, Japan, 3-4 trillion. So we're 7-8 times wealthier each year than the rest of the world. Russia, which fake news tells you to worry about, their GDP is 1.5 trillion. The Soviet Union went bankrupt, and Russia is 15, 20 times poorer than we are. So they're really not a big threat unless they would fire all their missiles at one time at us, and probably most of them don't work because they don't have the money to make them work. So again, fake news but the point I'm trying to make here is that our GDP means that we push science. We're much, much wealthier than the rest of the world. And so the world is worth $300 trillion. The United States is worth 100 trillion. We're 1/3 of the world. So we have to push science for progress and for human flourishing. So let's bring some House in at this time. Again, he says that the human condition is that everybody will lie to us, like the fake news on TV. The only variable is what will they lie about? People like to tell little white lies to get ahead in the world. Yeah, I'm not saying that. I'm an optimist. House is saying that, okay? I'm trying to be the good guy here, okay? So if you're taking a history on patients that are sick, then they're going to lie about how much alcohol they've used or where they've been Saturday night or that sort of thing. And we have to keep that in consideration. So let's talk a little bit about specific infectious diseases. Respiratory diseases. Flu season is upon us. What about the flu? It mutates every year. In crowded countries, there's 7 billion people in a year. In the United States, we only have 5% of the world's population. 95% of the people live in places like China and India. So they have 1 billion here and 1 billion there. That's where the flu in the crowded situations jumps back and forth from crowded people to pigs to birds. And so that's where the mutations come each year in the flu vaccine. So the annual flu is killing about 500,000 people a year, causing severe illness in about 5 million. We once had a Spanish flu in 1918 during World War I. 30 million people died. But again, I don't want to throw too many numbers at you, but we have to look at the flu. These vaccines, though, work. In the old, you need a higher dose. In the young, you need 2 doses. And they've just found in the last year or two, I do some research from time again, so I get excited about research. The flu vaccine is 100% effective if you use it, if the flu hits you right away. After 2 months, the flu vaccine is down to 80% effective against the flu. After 4 months, it's down to 60% effective against the flu. That's almost half. So if you get your flu vaccine, say, in September, October, November, December, January, by February, it's half as effective. You see, it wears off. They're just finding that out now with their research. So it's a good idea maybe to have your get your flu vaccine a little later, towards Thanksgiving or Christmas. So What about these crowded megacities that are going to cause infectious disease? Studies at Harvard and the United Nations say that New Delhi, India, by 2030 will have 43 million people. Tokyo will have 36 million people. It's in the 20s of millions now. Shanghai, China will have 34 million people. Mexico City will have 25 million. Beijing will have 25 million. Again, numbers can bore, but today, for instance, Los Angeles only has about 17 million people, you know, with the downtown and the suburbs. Chicago has about 8 million. Boston, about 8 million. Houston, about 6 million, you know, with the suburbs. Pittsburgh only has 333,000 downtown and maybe 1 to 2 million in the suburbs. So we're talking about 40 cities of 40 and 30 and 20 million coming up as the world gets more prosperous. So we're going to see a lot of respiratory diseases. Now, what disease will we see that gives you a sore throat, a pharyngitis? In other words, in infectious disease land, everybody, even normal people, are supposed to get one pharyngitis or sore throat a winter, maybe one flu, maybe 2 colds. That's normal. Well, actually, 7 out of 10 sore throats come from a virus called the adenovirus, and our drugs are not very good against viruses. 2 out of 10 would be strep sore throats, and so you need to take a penicillin for that, because it could have a complication and go and affect your heart with rheumatic heart disease and valve leakage, or your kidneys with a bloody kidney called glomerulonephritis. So these crowding are creating more and more infectious diseases as the world progresses. For instance, in the land of pneumonias, there's a dozen pneumonias out there, but we worry about 3. We worry about mycoplasma pneumonia, the walking pneumonia in the young, strep pneumonia in the middle-aged to old, and Klebsiella pneumonia is a gram-negative, that when people die in ICU, when they're 90 or so, they usually die of Klebsiella pneumonia. We fight it off during life. Our immune system is strong and fights Klebsiella off, but it gets old, like the rest of us get old, and then we die of Klebsiella in our 90s in ICU. So these are some of the infectious diseases that will increase as crowding in cities increases. Let's see. What about other diseases that might increase as the population gets older? Dementia, could that be caused by infection? Things like Alzheimer's, for instance. Well, we're still studying it. There is a clogging in the brain, like cholesterol clogs your coronary arteries and causes heart attacks. We have amyloid deposits in the brain that seem to be inflamed and clog up in dementia. And so stay tuned. We'll try to find out more about that. Let's skip back to wars. This is who's killing more, infectious disease versus wars. In which century were more people killed throughout history? Well, there's been genocide since ancient Old Testament times. Back in the Assyrian and Babylonian days, Moses said, utterly destroy them, leave nothing alive to breathe. So they killed the men, women, and children, and 500,000 were killed here, 500,000 were killed there. Today we try not to kill the women and children in war, but there's been secular wars, religious wars, Catholic crusades in 1100 AD killed many. The European religious Protestant wars in the 16th, 17th century killed about 10 million. And so wars all throughout history as you're well aware, have killed people. Was the 20th century then the most violent because we had science inventing more extreme weapons? Well, what about the 19th century? Then we had Napoleon and his 4 million deaths. We had the American Civil War and its 650,000 deaths. We had African slave raiding wars. So, in proportion, every century, wars have killed. So, suffering is inevitable. How do we deal with it? Do we deal with all this war and infection? I'm proposing science, okay? And House would say that, no, we suffer from selfish competition in science for status and glory. And Einstein would say, but without evolutionary competition, we'd still be single-cell organisms. Science opens minds, though, and can solve our problems if we use a little reason and sympathy and compassion. So back to infectious disease, there's a lot of skin diseases out there in a crowded world. Again, we have things like MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, which our antibiotics aren't working against, as every 10 or 15 years, the staph skin bacteria seems to mutate, and penicillins won't work, and then amoxicillin won't work, and then methicillin won't work, and then vancomycin won't work, and we keep trying different drugs. So we have to stay ahead of it. But the drug companies can't make a lot of money on antibiotics because you only take them for 10 days and then you're better. They don't want to make them. They're into profit, of course. They can make a lot more money making a drug that you take 365 days out of the year, like a blood pressure medicine or a cholesterol drug. So let's talk a little bit about how we fight back with the drugs and antibiotics and vaccines, but also with our immunology. Our immune system makes white blood cells, neutrophils, we make lymphocytes, we make T cells that tell the entire immune system what to do. Somebody has to be the command and control center. And we have immuno research is really big today because every day of your life, your immune system kills a germ, kills a bacteria, kills a virus, even kills a cancer cell before it can grow into a tumor until you get real old. And then your immune system gets old and it doesn't kill cancer cells anymore. And then your tumor takes off. And that's why old people have more cancers than young people. So we're working with the immune system to try to get it souped up to control diseases. We're working with immunosuppression and transplants. And we've increased the life expectancy. The life expectancy all throughout history for thousands and thousands of years, people died in their 40s. Today we live to be 80 in most of the world. The advanced technological science countries, we live to be 80. And even in places like Africa and third world countries, South America, they're starting to live to be 70 with science, with all our antibiotics and vaccines. So House would say then, my science has solved all your problems. Why do you complain about my science? Why do you complain about autism being caused by vaccines? The women are all protesting, not here so much, but in California and Washington and Oregon. They are protesting against vaccines. They don't want their children to have 50, 60 shots by the time they go to first grade. They think these vaccines are causing autism. And if they stop taking these vaccines, all these diseases are going to come back. The MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella, stops us from getting measles, mumps, and rubella. DPT, diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, stops us from getting diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. And people used to die from just stepping on a rusty nail, they would die of tetanus. Now they don't, because we get vaccines like the DPT vaccine. So there are political problems holding science back. And that takes us into the world of medical ethics. I like to teach ethics because scientists I'm a little bit of a scientist, and I do some research now and then. And scientists, I worked with Dr. Fisher at Shadyside, and we worked on micrometastasis of breast cancer. And his brother over at Presbyterian came up with surgical ability to not remove the entire breast, but just do modified mastectomies. And the scientists have a moral responsibility to explain our work. If we don't, we say science doesn't matter. And so ethics was born. I don't know if I have time, but let me just talk for a minute about ethics, because it's fascinating that the history of ethics. I have to do this quickly, so focus as I tell my students. But in the 1950s, a fellow named Kolff came out with the first ethical dilemma. He invented the cannula for dialysis, and in the 62, it was Scribner. He got the indwelling shunt to make dialysis feasible, but it was very, very expensive back then. And so they came up with a God committee in the 60s where who would get dialysis and who wouldn't, who would live and who would die. And they had physicians and ministers and people on it. And that worked for a while until a woman by the name of Shana Alexander in Time magazine got hold of this and said, wait a second, why are you playing God? And then Edmund Newman was on NBC News, and he blabbed it to the entire country. And then they went into the Congress and all kind of problems. So they decided that every American has the right to dialysis. This is America, and we don't care what the cost is, but it was very expensive. Give it to everybody, and so our health care costs started to soar. So that was the beginning of healthcare problems, and then they escalated. In the 1970s and 80s, we came out with artificial hearts and transplants, which cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And does everybody have a right to get a transplant? We started making lists. We had Governor Casey right here in Pennsylvania. He had amyloidosis around 1990. He needed both a heart and a liver transplant. And they were saying he had privilege and was moved to the top of the list. Maybe not. But we had Mickey Mantle, who was a great baseball player, you may remember, but he was a bit of a womanizer and alcoholic. And when he was done, he needed a liver transplant, and he was moved to the top of a list down in Houston. But about a year later, he died because he continued to drink. So this brought a lot of ethical problems into the world with medical ethics. And we had, then in the year 2000 and so, we had the Karen Quinlan case, Nancy Cruzan, where people, couldn't we take them off a ventilator when they're gotten into a vegetative state? And we had ideas of autonomy and competency, living wills, futility, rationing, caretaker burden. You know, all these ethical principles started to develop. But the most important thing was we were spending too much money on technology and science, and we can't afford to give all these fancy cures to everybody. So let's get back then to our premise of infectious disease versus war. Smallpox almost killed Abraham Lincoln. He caught it during office, but he survived. Also, Queen Elizabeth of England, she caught it. We've had 10,000 years of infectious death, killing civilization after civilization. Someday it may happen to America. Some disease may get away from us, kill half of us, and then we'll be conquered. What about war? Violence has been in decline, though, for the last 50 to 75 years. We are probably living in the least violent period in human history, although they tell you on TV, worry about the terrorists. But there are more people killed each year by bee stings than by terrorists. They don't tell you that, okay? The tone of the news is bad. It's cynical. They just want to scare you and make you tune in. But we're flourishing with science. Our markets are overflowing. Our sons are without war for the last 60 years. I mean, no major wars between major countries like, say, Russia against the United States or China, or major wars. Our daughters are safe to walk the streets. If you criticize the government, you're not shot. Our vaccines and antibiotics are working. We can travel like a bird. We fly all around the world, and then we complain that, they hassled us. Well, it used to take 6 months to get to California, and now it takes, 4 hours or something like that? So science has brought poverty actually in the world down from 75% to 10%. Only 10% of the world now is in extreme poverty. People in Africa have cell phones now, and it's going to get even better. Why do we still have war? Well, that has to do with neurology, and we have the same brainstem, the thalamus, midbrain, pons, medulla, as animals have. And so there's a lot of violent impulses towards greed, lust, domination, sex, violence. But we keep it down. Scientists have found that we have our higher brain, our cerebrum, has areas of sympathy and compassion and sharing. All you have to do is look at a mother who's dealing with her child, and you can see all that sympathy. So we have ways of dealing with our violent nature. In the last few minutes here, before we take questions, let me just say that violence and war is down, punishment is down. Back in the 17 and 1800s, there were 200 ways, capital offenses, ways you could be put to death for poaching, for counterfeiting, for being a gypsy, for being a witch, for, we don't put people to death so much anymore. Battle deaths are way down, even in civil wars. I'm not talking about wars now between great, and science has analyzed all this with a scientific method, and the data is out. It's all been graphed. So the last 50 to 60 years, the world is getting better and better and better. Lifespan, war, infectious disease, you name it, it's getting better. Now, does that mean that tomorrow we couldn't have World War III? No, I'm not talking about the future. I'm just talking about the last 400 years. Things have been getting better. Than the last 75 years, things have been really getting better. But you won't see that on TV. So, why don't you see it on TV? Well, House would say everybody lies. Newscasters are lying to you. Your patients would be lying to you about drinking, how much they drink, or where they were Saturday night. The ideas then of the diseases we still have to deal with. Again, I said that there's 7 billion people in the world. 500 million people still have TB, but mostly overseas. We've beaten it in the United States for the most part. 500 million people still have hepatitis. There's 3 hepatitises, A, B, and C. A, you might remember, is infectious. It was a Chi-Chi's about 10 years ago, but we've beaten that one back. B is from needle sticks, and hospitals have beaten that one back. But hepatitis C is a problem now because it's from lifestyle, from people getting 20 tattoos and 20 piercings and that sort of thing. And we have an increase of hepatitis C in the United States and all throughout the world. Other infectious diseases, sexually transmitted diseases. Again, I don't want to bore you with numbers, but there's 333 million people in the United States, 333. 1 out of every 4 have a sexually transmitted disease. There's 30 million people with chlamydia. It's a bacteria, but we can cure that. If we don't, it causes infertility and pelvic inflammatory disease or adhesions where everything sticks together, the fallopian tubes. Another 30 million people have herpes, and that causes painful blisters, and it recurs again and again and again throughout your lives. And another 30 million people have the human papilloma virus, HPV, and that can cause in women especially cervical cancer. So 30, 30, 30, that's almost 100 million people out of 333 million people who have these 3 sexually diseases. But we have beat syphilis back with penicillins. We have beat HIV back with our drugs. We have beat gonorrhea back with Cipro. That's a medicine, although it's starting to mutate and become resistant to Cipro. So we have to keep working, keep trying to stay ahead. Infectious diseases, when they get to the end of their process, they spread throughout all the blood and you become septic. Sepsis causes shock with a blood pressure less than 90 over 60. People faint and they start to die. Why do they die? They die from something called DIC, or disseminated intravascular clotting, or their blood starts to clot and bleed, internal hemorrhaging and clotting, and that's fatal. You can't do that all over your body, especially in the lungs. If you have scar tissue from clotting in the lungs, you can't move oxygen in and take carbon dioxide back out. So in terms of polio, some of you were exposed to polio. Polio is interesting. I might finish up with that. Again, after World War II, people were tired of fighting and living in foxholes, and the women were tired of working in the factories. And we had a real conservative world where everybody just kind of went to the suburbs, had a lot of babies, a lot of crowding among children, and there was a lot of polio. But the United States is a great country in terms of science when we get our act together. So in the 50s, we decided to focus all our might and channel our money towards beating polio with vaccines. So Salk up at Pitt invented his vaccine. Sabin up in Paris, I believe, invented another vaccine. And both of them seemed to work. Both of them had advantages and disadvantages. But they were so competitive and so ruthless and so cutthroat that they were arguing which one is the better. And it was so ugly in the newspapers and everything that neither one was given the Nobel Prize. But we did come up with this vaccine to eliminate polio, and we've eliminated it all throughout the world, just like we did smallpox, except for places like Afghanistan and Pakistan, where they won't let us in the country to give the polio vaccine. So let me finish up. It's getting late, but we may have a difference of opinion on whether science is going to end the world with a third nuclear war or science is going to save the world. But that's fine. You know, we're allowed to agree to disagree. But science has made the last 50, 60, 70 years the best time to be alive, despite what you see on your newscasts. So you should count your blessings and understand that the world has never been at peace as much as it is now. Over the past 4,000 years, peace was only about 200, 250 years until recently. Okay, now we don't have any wars between major powers. 130 million people were killed in wars in the 20th century alone. Throughout history, probably 500 million people were killed throughout history, if you go way back, because you have fewer and fewer people in the world as you go back. But infectious diseases killed more, especially the mosquito. The mosquito is deadly, and with global warming coming, and we're supposed to have the same climate as Charlotte, North Carolina, in about 25 years. It's coming up, Maybe we'll get more and more mosquitoes. Mosquitoes have killed more people throughout history than infectious diseases or wars. Mosquitoes are bad. Mosquitoes, especially malaria, kills people overseas, in Africa and Asia. But around here we have Zika, Dengue, yellow fever, and they're headed our way. So I think what we're going to have to do is turn to science to solve that problem. And so I thank you for your kind attention. And I'm sorry if I took too much of your time. It would have been better with slides, but we did the best we could. So
okay, we've got a few minutes, and we'll take a few questions.
Can you talk a little bit about the Ebola problem in Africa and how it can affect us?
Yeah, sure. Let me hand this out just quickly. We don't have a lot of time. Well, some of you might hang around. But, Gary, could you maybe put one of these in each row? And, or one of these in each row or something. But anyway, in one of these magazines is a little explanation of Ebola. And here's a pitch for Pitt and UPMC. I shouldn't probably give you this one, but they do a lot of transplants. So, but Ebola is a virus, so we can't see it with our microscopes in every laboratory and every hospital. It's tiny, tiny, tiny. It started in Africa, 50 years ago or so. Maybe it started in monkeys. That's the theory, and maybe some of the African people ate some monkeys or did something. But anyway, however it started, it got into some African communities, and it still does that today every year or two or three. And it causes a blood septic infection, which I just described to you. It's called DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation or clotting, where your blood in all your organs starts to bleed and clot and bleed and clot and internal hemorrhaging, and that's fatal. Sepsis itself, in all our internal our ICUs, 40% of the people who get sepsis die. Despite all of our medicines and all of our 21st century technology, 40%, almost half the people that get septic go into septic shock and die no matter what we do, and that's kind of embarrassing, really. But with Ebola, 75% die, okay? So what saves us? Well, it's not spread through respiratory droplets. Now, if I sneeze, you're not going to get Ebola. It doesn't, you have to physically touch people to get Ebola. Physically. And so we hope it never mutates. If it ever mutates, which it probably won't, then we'd all be in trouble because it would ravage the world. But right now you have to touch people, and so we try to explain to the Africans, don't touch each other. We try to hold back the epidemics that start in Africa, and we try to keep it from someone getting on a plane, coming over here and touching people. And so it's not the most dangerous virus. The most dangerous viruses are the ones that are spread when you sneeze. Those are the ones we worry about. So, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Hospital-acquired infection. Yeah. That is a problem that's kind of hushed up. And so I try to explain that these bacteria mutate every 15 years or so. Not all the bacteria, but some of the more virulent ones do, more potent ones. And so they mutate, and occasionally bacteria like MRSA staph or Klebsiella get away from us. And all of a sudden we have this mutated bacteria after a few 15-year generations that we can't, it's pan-resistant. We use all the antibiotics we have and we can't kill it. And so where do these people end up with pan-resistant MRSA or pan-resistant Klebsiella? ICU. And then the ICU goes, oh, wow, what are we going to do now? Should we shut down the hospital? Then we wouldn't make a profit. It's probably the world runs on money and profit, so let's isolate, let's create 2 ICUs, and let's make this ICU an isolated ICU with Klebsiella patients only, and the other ICU for everybody else. And they try to contain it with isolation methods, which would take a long time to explain, but maybe you understand that. And usually they can. But they're all afraid that someday they won't be able to contain one of these hospital-acquired infections, and then it'll get away from us 15, 20, 30, 40 years from now. So it is a problem. Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Well, let me talk about China first. In the in 1990s, the GDP of the United States was only 5 or 6 trillion, and China was less than 1, maybe a half. And then the internet revolution, science, technology came along, and we went from 5 or 6 trillion to 21. And China is the only country in the world that kind of copied all our secrets, stole all our science and technology, and they've come up ahead of Europe to about 12 or 13 trillion, and they're starting to catch us. And the rest of the world is way behind us. We're 21 trillion. The rest of the world's around 3 trillion. Russia around 1.5 trillion. So China, by stealing all our secrets, they're good at what they do. And they don't have ethics like we have. They do ethical research that we won't do, and they yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah. But you're right. Can you repeat it? Well, yeah, that's emotionally charged. I'm not sure I want to go there, but it is. But let me just say this. I'll give you the facts. Evidence-based science, evidence-based medicine. Okay, just the facts, and you can make your own judgments, ethical judgments. The abortions are one of the most common surgical procedures in the United States. Most years, there's right around 1 million abortions a year. If you do that for 10 years, 10 million, 20 years, 20 million. And so people require abortions. And so what are you going to do? Are you going to send them to the back alley where they get infectious diseases from having abortions that are outside of hospitals, or are you going to do them in the hospitals? And then you have to decide, well, all these people want abortions, what trimester, should we do it, which not? And that's, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not on the Supreme Court, that's up to you and the Supreme Court to decide. So do you have an opinion on that? Well, luckily I don't have to judge that. People like you or the Supreme Court can make decisions on subjects like that. So, yeah.
No doubt there is medicinal value in some of the chemicals that are in marijuana, but what I'd like you to address maybe scientifically is what happens to the human mind with the active ingredients of THC in the marijuanas that are today that are much more potent than they were in the 60s when we grew up.
Yeah.
Because states that have legalized recreational use of marijuana have seen an increasingly a huge spike in homicides because of the paranoia that it supposedly caused. Can you kind of give a little bit of a...
Well, they relieve pain, so that's good. But they deaden your intellect to a certain extent over the long term, so you're not quite as smart. And but if someone's dying of cancer or something like that, I mean, how smart do you have to be? You know what I mean? You just want to enjoy the rest of your life without pain. So there's advantages and disadvantages. And so, again, I'm not the judge. I just want to give you evidence-based medicine, evidence-based science, and you judge. You're smart. Maybe your wisdom is better than mine, but it sounds like marijuana is coming. It's going to be legalized in a lot of states. So.
Okay, it's the last question.
Okay.
It's not like it's, there's lots of advertisements, and everybody's pushing antibacterial soap when you wash your hands and wherever you go. Isn't that creating a lot of resistant bacteria, and isn't that going to be a major problem?
Yes and no. We have to stop these infections from spreading around hospitals. We don't want hospitals to be dangerous. We want them to be safe. So you should wash your hands a lot with these soaps. But there are, now this is not fact. It's called a hypothesis. It hasn't been proven with a scientific method, but there's a hygiene hypothesis that says that if you shouldn't kill all germs, that yes, you should kill the ones around hospitals, but especially with little children, they need to be exposed to germs because their immune system has to grow and develop properly. And if you put them in a sterile environment, they will not develop a good immune system, and they will have what's called a failure to thrive. That's the diagnosis that the pediatricians put on them. So they want children to not be in too much of a sterile environment. See, when a baby is born, the baby's in the embryo, inside the mother, there's no bacteria, no viruses. Then suddenly it's born, and now it has to deal with all the bacteria and viruses that come through its lungs and through its food, and it has to start to develop an immune system to fight the good ones, keep the good ones, to help metabolize vitamins, get rid of the bad ones. And so a child needs to be exposed to germs. And so yes, you want to wash your hands a lot around hospitals, but your children need a little dirt.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr.
Dr. Carugati, thank you very much. I suspect there's some more questions out there, so come on up and speak to the doctor.